Hello, my name is Colin Farrelly. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University in Canada, and this is an online video recording of the lecture that I gave for the inaugural Peacock professorship lecture on Geroscience and Political Imagination, the Science of Healthy Aging at Queen's University on March 8, 2024. So my background training is in political theory and philosophy, which means that I study the realm of ideas and ideals. And half of the teaching I do in my department concerns the ideas of the past. I teach 2 courses on the history of political thought to undergraduate students in our program. And then the other half of my teaching is divided between 2 courses, an undergraduate and a graduate level course on science and justice, which focuses on advances in biomedical research for the future of humanity. So I study abstract concepts, ideals, and I also focus mostly on the past and the future, which I guess reflects my somewhat aversion to contemporary politics. But every now and then I do come down into the contemporary context, as I am today, to reflect on the future of science innovation and the ethical and social implications that has for aging populations. But let me begin first by drawing some insights from the thinkers of the past who inspire me. When we think about the canon of the history of political thought, I think the thinkers that have stayed with us the most as a source of inspiration share various epistemic and intellectual traits, even though they represent diverse political traditions. So one of those traits is curiosity. They were curious about the predicaments their societies faced. They observed what was going on, and they often identified things that most of their contemporaries didn't even recognize as a pressing practical predicament. These thinkers were also intellectual risk takers. That is, they recommended pursuing a course of action that most of their contemporaries wouldn't have conceptualized and were actually against. So sometimes this actually put their own lives at peril. So Socrates, for example, was condemned to death for corrupting the minds of young Athenians, and Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated for his engagement in civil disobedience to protest segregation. And when we study the past thinkers, it reminds us of how powerful ideas can be as a catalyst for change. And here are 3 great examples from the 18th and 19th century. The Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who diagnosed the cause of political inequality in his own time, living in France. And this inequality was not natural, conjectured Rousseau, and he advocated for democratic transformation, the idea of the general will, and that the law must come from all and apply to all. And Rousseau's ideas had a profound impact on the French Revolution after his death. And his body was actually exhumed and buried now in the Pantheon as a testament to how important Rousseau's ideas were with the French Revolution. Mary Wollstonecraft, another theorist who theorized about the inequalities of her day, and she identified that the causes of gender inequality were not nature, but rather nurture, and the different education young boys and girls received. And she knew this through her own experience as a teacher and educator. And so she advocated for an ideal of marriage that was one of equality between the husband and wife rather than the patriarchal family. And finally, if we move into the 19th century, Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery in the southern states in the U.S., details the toll of slavery on his own life and family. And at age 20, he was able to escape slavery and went on to become a prominent anti-slavery activist. And in 1865, at the end of the American Civil War, the 13th constitutional amendment was passed that abolished slavery. So when we look to the past, we now, with the benefit of hindsight, can say, well, of course, political inequality and gender and racial inequality were pressing problems in those times and continue to into the current context. But most of their contemporaries were not aware of these problems. In fact, the default setting for humanity is one with cognitive blinders that can impede our vision of the moral landscape. So I see political theory and political philosophy as helping us refine tools of cognitive flexibility to look at problems in novel ways and to advance novel solutions to those problems. And that's what I'm going to be doing in this inaugural lecture. So most of my research actually focuses on the future of humanity, though I draw inspiration from the past. And for me, there are two major issues for the 21st century that require political theory to update its skills and cognitive flexibility. And the first of those challenges is the rapid pace of scientific innovation and technological advancement. Science policy is by far, in my opinion, the biggest area of government decision-making that will impact the health, economic well-being, and overall happiness of humans in the 21st century. And so we really need to make sure that we update our political theories and our accounts of ethics to keep pace with the rapid speed of technological advancement. And my talk is only going to focus on one small section of science policy, namely biomedical innovation. And it's linked to what I see as the biggest neglected issue of the 21st century, which is the phenomenon of population aging. And I'll say from the start, I don't adopt a negative or catastrophic frame around population aging. It's actually the pinnacle achievement of humanity that a baby born into the world today has a life expectancy exceeding 73 years of age, and that will rise to age 81. But there's still a lot of inequality in lifespan for human populations in the world. And aging populations will come up against some novel public health predicaments that we never faced before as we start to come up against the health limitations of the inborn aging process itself. So the specifics of what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to integrate some insights from recent research I've published over the last year, as well as some new and ongoing research. I'm going to begin first by detailing the role of imagination in medical science, specifically drawing on some important lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. And that will draw from some conclusions in a recent article that I published in the Royal Society's Open Science. I will then detail new research for me, which is on the insights of science communication as political communication and the important implications this has for geroscience. And then I will finish by just giving you an example of how you can frame geroscience in a way that resonates with the political socio context of science communication and advocacy by showing the video abstract of a recent article I published in Aging Cell on climate science and geroscience. So let's start first with the COVID-19 pandemic. And progress in medical science occurs when there's progress on two distinct but interrelated pillars, which I have represented by these staircases. So one of those pillars is gathering credible empirical evidence concerning the safety and efficacy of any drug, surgery, vaccination, or behavior modification that is going to be authorized by public health and medicine. And this can often take many years, if not decades. And it can often be a one step forward, two step back kind of predicament. But it's critical to trust in public health and medicine, that we have evidence-based approach to medicine. Now, that issue itself in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic became very politicized. I'm actually not going to be talking about that, though one could unpack that and spend, a great deal of time discussing that. I'm actually going to be focusing on the second pillar, and this is before one has a intervention that you're going to test in a clinical trial, somebody has to conceptualize some new way of reducing the risk of a disease or promoting health. So this is the imagination and idealism that takes place at the earlier stage. And that actually was the focus of an absolutely brilliant but long forgotten article in JAMA back in 1910 by Christian Herder. So I think this is just an amazing article, and I've used this article to anchor 2 or 3 recent articles that I've published on medical science. So Herder was a physician and pathologist. He was homeschooled, and at the tender age of 15, he started at Columbia University in the Department of Surgery and Medicine. And within 3 years, he had his MD. So he was an experimentalist. He actually had a laboratory built into the house in which he lived, and he was also the co-founder of the Journal of Biological Chemistry. And Herder made a great distinction between 2 modes of imagination and idealism. The first one is humanitarian medicine. This focuses on the direct and obvious paths of ameliorating human suffering. But it's the second curiosity-oriented medical science that I want to draw our attention to. This often is achieved through pursuing pure science, just for its own sake, especially chemistry and physics. And it often reveals indirect ways of promoting health, what Herder called the citadel of health. And his prime example, he actually published a book on Louis Pasteur in the early 1900s. Pasteur had his PhD in chemistry and physics. His PhD thesis research was on the crystals created during wine fermentation. So you wouldn't have thought there was any clear medical application that would come from this kind of research. But Herder describes curiosity-oriented medical science as a stream with its ebbs and flows that slowly is edging its way towards medical utility, but it faces its setbacks and its skeptics. But it keeps progressing slowly and often has really transformative implications. And this was certainly the case for Louis Pasteur because his research ultimately led to pasteurization, and he also developed a vaccine for rabies and anthrax. So sometimes doing research on just pure science through the experimental method is how major innovations are made. And when we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, we can see both of these arms of imagination and idealism were at play. When COVID-19 first occurred 4 years ago in March 2020, the alarm bell of humanitarian medicine was primed. That is, focus on the things that we know we can do that tend to work for infectious diseases, such as quarantining the sick, social distancing, washing your hands, wearing face masks. And there were various types of idealism that were invoked and became very politicized early on during the pandemic. There were some that believed you could achieve COVID-0, that if you just locked down hard enough and long enough, you could stamp out SARS-CoV-2. The dominant narrative in most of the Western liberal democracies was this idea of flattening the curve or circuit breakers, that as the numbers were surging, we would then go into lockdown and bring down the numbers just to avoid overwhelming the healthcare system. And there were some that also advocated a focused protection strategy, that is, before the vaccinations, to allow healthy younger people in particular to go back to normal life and acquire some natural immunity as a way of minimizing the risks to the more vulnerable. Now, this became extremely politicized, and we all know how things unfolded over the coming 2 to 3 years after the initial outbreak. But the real game changer came from curiosity-oriented medical science. And this was in the form of the mRNA vaccinations for COVID-19. So the history of these vaccines, which are a result of experimental science, go back over half a century of research that didn't have any clear medical application initially. So in the 1960s, mRNA was discovered. By the 70s, liposomes were used for vaccine delivery. In the 90s, it was tested as a cancer vaccine in mice, and then for rabies more recently. And then finally, as SARS-CoV-2 emerged, it was quickly utilized for the COVID-19 vaccines through the emergency use authorization. estimates suggest that maybe as many as 14 million people had their lives saved in that first year of vaccine rollout. And the COVID-19 pandemic declared no longer a public health emergency of international concern in May of 2023. So I'm going to utilize this same division between humanitarian medicine and curiosity-oriented science, which we had for the COVID-19 pandemic, for what I think is the primary aspiration and goal of medical science in the post-COVID-19 pandemic era. So rather than just go to the obvious route of preparing for the next infectious disease outbreak, which I believe is important, but I think it would be short-sighted not to look at the reality that advanced age was actually the biggest risk factor for COVID-19 mortality and serious illness. So with the United Nations actually initially planned to declare 2020 to 2030 as the decade of healthy aging, but they recalibrated that from 2021 to 2030 in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. But in the science of healthy aging, you can see this division again that Herder notes between humanitarian medicine, which is to focus on the direct and obvious paths of ameliorating human suffering in late life. So these would be the types of things that we commonly would identify as being able to promote the human health span. So stop smoking, exercise, improve the living conditions, an equitable distribution of the social determinants of health, improving long-term care, which was really amplified during the COVID-19 pandemic, reducing ageism. So this would be the types of measures that we can pursue right now to try to prevent some of the onset of age-related disease, frailty, and disability. But there's this other dimension, and the thing that Herder notes is that the strongest advocates of humanitarian medicine are often oppositional to curiosity-oriented medical science. They see it as, you're just wasting your time experimenting on things that may not lead to any innovation. But this would be a very short-sighted approach. We really need all the tools in the toolbox, especially to promote health in late life. So this is what the field of geroscience is proposing. It actually is this curiosity-oriented approach to medical science applied to biological aging itself. So the geroscience hypothesis maintains that strategies could be designed to modify the biological drivers of aging, to increase health span, that is, the number of years people are healthy, rather than just delaying the age of death by managing multimorbidity for a longer period of time. And the really transformative potential of an aging intervention is that this would simultaneously delay the onset of the most prevalent chronic diseases. And so I have a castle here representing the citadel of health in late life, and the various species that experimental gerontology has been working on to show that aging is not immutable, that you can actually alter the rate of aging. And so I'll give you a quick snapshot of the century of experimental research that has been building momentum. And this research really goes back initially into the 1920s and 1930s on dietary restriction in rodents. So by 1935, it was demonstrated that by utilizing caloric restriction in mice, that is, if you restricted without causing malnutrition, by 40% the amount of calories a mice lives, you can get a 40% increase in lifespan. Now, just to show the magnitude of what that would mean, we're probably not going to get the same magnitude of an aging intervention in humans that we do with mice, and certainly not from caloric restriction, which would be too burdensome for somebody to pursue for many decades, right? We love food, and it's a quality of life over quantity of life issue. But if this same effect of caloric restriction in mice were to apply in humans, this would mean it would take me 110 years to be physiologically like I will at age 80, right? So it's about increasing the health of through your 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, and pushing the stage of life where we have reduced health and vitality into the later stages of life. But as I mentioned, dietary restriction is not going to be an intervention that we can utilize in people. But the next phase was the era of genetic manipulation, where researchers realized that you can actually get this lifespan increase in mice, worms, and flies by manipulating genes. Right? It wasn't only through caloric restriction. You could actually activate the genes that are activated by caloric restriction. So that really was another exciting stage of moving this forward. But even still, we're not going to be able to do irreversible genome editing for aging in humans, which would cost millions of dollars and create lots of challenges around how you could safely experiment in humans. But the real game changer that took this more from the realm of theoretical science fiction to something to actually test in the laboratory for humans is the third phase, the phase of pharmacological and pharmaceutical interventions. So it was discovered that particular molecules can be consumed to mimic the effects of genetic manipulation and dietary restriction without having to have your genome edited or strictly diet. And two of those molecules are actually drugs that have been used in humans for many decades. Metformin is one, which is a drug used for diabetes. So it's got a long track record of safety in humans, and it's off patent, meaning it's a generic, cheap drug to develop. And rapamycin, which is another drug that has been used for organ transplant patients. So this is where the excitement of geroscience has really gained steam just in the last 10 to 15 years. The idea of repurposing drugs that have been typically used for targeting specific diseases to now target it for the biological mechanisms of aging. Because you want to prove it's safe as well as effective, and something that could be widely accessible if it's a cost-effective intervention. And that is what the field of geroscience is really aiming to achieve. So there's a great article in Science on healthy aging as the ultimate preventative medicine. And just to read a passage from that, it's clear that directly targeting aging is theoretically superior to treating individual chronic diseases. But until recently, translational approaches to achieve this goal have been just that, purely theoretical. So in the past, like we've known for many decades, that getting older increases your risk of cancer, heart disease, stroke, and Alzheimer's. But we thought there was nothing you could do to change the rate of senescence. But now science has demonstrated, so among biogerontologists, there is a consensus that aging is not fixed. It is a mutable. It is something that can be modulated. There's still a lot of epistemic uncertainty about how can you safely and effectively do that in humans. And so the field is trying to focus on narrowing that gap between where the science is. And my interest as a political philosopher and bioethicist is to theorize about the societal implications of shifting from a fixation on trying to cure each single disease one at a time to, as the article indicates, the ultimate preventative medicine, which would be an intervention that would slow down the rate of aging. All right, so I'm going to draw on some insights from Dieter Schuffel's excellent article, Science Communication as Political Communication. Before scientific innovation takes place, somebody has to advocate for that scientific innovation. That means somebody's asking for, research investment from the National Institutes of Health or whatever the organization is in your particular country. And this means that that science communication, because there's a lot of uncertainty around the magnitude of the benefits and how successful different strategies will be, scientific debates are often blurred in terms of what is the science and what is the political, moral, and legal implications that come with its societal implications. So I actually think it's more important now than ever for political scientists to immerse themselves in the intersection between science and politics, because there's so many critical decisions that are being made that are become hyper politicized, and we need to make sure that we can separate out the facts from the value judgments that are being often integrated. So here's a snapshot of the plurality of scientific issues that have become politicized. So in the 1990s, opposition to GMOs, so that the labeling of frankenfood. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I would say there was the politics on both the left and the right. It became, a prime example of how quickly the politicalization of science can occur. In climate change, there is a lot of this, and AI has also followed this similar course. Now, with the kind of main conclusion that I argue in my research that I hope to build together on the research I've published recently into a book manuscript, the initial communicative frame of public health in medicine, like if you search up what is public health, you will find Charles Winslow's definition in his science article from 1920 called The Untilled Fields of Public Health. And public health was conceptualized as the art and science of disease prevention and prolonging life. Now, when Winslow wrote those words, the leading causes of death in the United States were infectious diseases that caused very high rates of early life mortality. So smallpox, cholera, dysentery, polio, malaria. And that initial frame was very effective in the stage of the sanitation revolution, where hygiene and improving living conditions were critical to abate the extrinsic risk factors of a world that has over 1,400 organisms that cause infectious disease. But by the middle of the 20th century, that same approach was then applied to the chronic diseases of late life, such as the war against cancer that Richard Nixon launched in 1972. And as populations get into the upper bounds of human longevity, the war against disease has diminishing health returns, right? So eliminating polio and smallpox and dysentery can confer many decades of healthy life expectancy on the children that would have died of those conditions. But that's not the case for eliminating any specific disease of late life, because of the plurality of diseases that occur in the 7th, 8th, and 9th decade. So I believe we need to shift or at least supplement the saving lives, conquering disease perspective with one that also allows room for medical innovation that will improve the quality of life in late life. And this may mean that we don't actually conquer a disease, but we delay the onset of all of those diseases that typically afflict us in our 70s and 80s. So this is what the field of geroscience is proposing. The kind of key concept is to improve our biological resilience through the lifespan, but especially in advanced life, to prevent the onset of those conditions. So to go back to COVID-19, for example, as great as the vaccines were at reducing mortality and serious illness, unfortunately, they didn't have any impact on the risk of cancer, heart disease, and stroke, which is what actually kills most of the people that were in the highest risk category for severe COVID-19. So what Geroscience is proposing is an innovation that would not only reduce the risk of COVID-19 mortality, but heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, etc., by targeting biological aging itself. And this is particularly imperative in a warming planet because the public health risks of climate change are mostly going to be falling on the world's aging populations. And it's also imperative for combating the public health risks in the lower and middle income countries. So aging populations in environments that do not have the kinds of benefits that the richer countries have in terms of healthcare, their healthcare system or government pension. So remaining healthy in late life is an issue of development, and it's critical, especially for the world's lower and middle income countries. Now, the day of this presentation is actually March 8th, the International Day of Women. And so it's also worth pointing out, as another way of framing the importance of geroscience, is that most of the world's oldest population are female. Women live on average 4.8 years longer than men. However, they live with poorer health compared to those age-matched men that do survive into later life. So I published a paper in the Journal of Population Aging in the summer of last year, and I developed a number of points to show that, geroscience advocacy is also about promoting the health of and well-being of women. I also care about promoting men's health. It also applies equally to men. But most of the caring responsibilities for looking after aging parents fall disproportionately on daughters. So data in the United States suggests that about twice as much time is devoted from daughters to caring for their parents than compared to sons. So in advocating for geroscience, we're also advocating for promoting health and redressing the other vulnerabilities that can come with late life. Now, I have a couple of quick slides just to give some data that I jokingly put to abate any population aging deniers that are out there. And I say that in jest, but one of the things I think I've learned in engaging with social scientists over the last 2 decades on this topic is that many people still have a view of global health that's antiquated. They believe that it's only in the rich countries in the world that populations are aging and surviving into more advanced ages. And they also think that health disparities are growing rather than compressing. So these 4 slides I'll go through quickly just to kind of make sure that we have an accurate understanding of the health predicaments of global populations. And this is particularly important for framing geroscience advocacy because there's problems like competition for attention. Most of the news we will hear are things we hear because it's negative, right? So we'll hear about the world's problems, and those are important to address, but things that are not easily playing into that negativity bias are often ignored. And I would say that population aging is one of those things. And many areas of science are politicized and polarized. So I think it's really important to make sure that the science of healthy aging is effectively framed so that it gets attention but doesn't perpetuate ageist or catastrophic narratives of population aging. So here's the first data that the reality is there's over 1 billion people over 60 already. That will rise to 2 billion by 2050 and 3 billion by 2100. And as I mentioned, this is a success story. These are the children that would have died of smallpox and tuberculosis and cholera in the past. But it's important to recognize that most of those people over age 60 are living in lower and middle income countries by 2050, right? So 2/3. We need to update our understanding of what's going on in the world's aging populations, that most of these people, so think of Asia, for example, that is where these older populations are in larger numbers. And I often get asked about, well, what about, redressing early life mortality, which, of course, I'm a strong advocate of trying to reduce the mortality risk for children. And as you can see here, under 5 mortality has dramatically reduced, such that a baby born into the world already has a life expectancy exceeding 73 years, and this will rise to age 81. So most children will survive into late life and die from the chronic diseases of later life. So I do think geroscience is something that will benefit the vast majority of children in the world, but not when they're children, when they're older. But to target the under 5 mortality rate, which I agree we should, we don't need biomedical innovation. We need to tackle the problems of poverty and infectious disease and the mortality risks that come from conflict and war. So I'm in favor of both of these things, improving the opportunities for health across the lifespan, but I'm focusing primarily on geroscience advocacy because that usually is not on the radar for most people in terms of when they think about what is entailed by a right to health. And I think it's about improving the health prospects across the lifespan. And finally, a slide on the important point about the disparity in life expectancy. So as you can see, there's variation in how long people can expect to live in the world, and the size of these bubbles indicate the size of the population living in them. And we see 14% of the world's population in sub-Saharan Africa have a life expectancy in the low 60s. So this needs to be rectified and addressed. But it's important to put this snapshot, this is a synchronic snapshot, it needs to be put in a diachronic context, like, where was it 50 years ago and where is it going in the future? So if you went back 50 years ago, these bubbles shrunk and everyone went down. But the more important issue is, where is it going in the future? And in my opinion, one of the biggest disagreements in science in the late 20th century was among demographers concerning what will happen to life expectancy in the richest countries. And there are basically 2 camps, which I'll just characterize this debate quickly. One camp, which I'll call the statisticians, argued that because the U.S. had a 30-year increase in life expectancy in the 20th century, it's reasonable to infer there will be a 30-year increase in the 21st century. This kind of linear projection will just continue. So their motto was the past predicts the future. But the other camp argued that biology trumps math. And so they were the realists, and they argued that actually obesity will reduce life expectancy. And there's an upper limit, like based on insights from comparative biology, you can put mice in the ideal environment for food and exercise, but they don't keep living infinitely longer. They eventually get cancer even in the ideal life environment. So I think this realist camp has won the day. I mean, the U.S. life expectancy has now been declining. It's no longer increasing. So there's actually the biggest gains in life expectancy are occurring in the world's poorest regions because saving children from premature death adds many years. But saving somebody who's 83 from one particular type of cancer does not add many years because some other type of cancer or heart disease and stroke will get them shortly thereafter. So there actually is a narrowing of this disparity because aging is the kind of universal equalizer. And just to point out that because of improvements in early life mortality and the higher rates of birth, sub-Saharan Africa will actually triple in size by 2100 and rise to the mid-70s. So the geroscience innovations that I'm talking about are interventions that will promote the health of these larger, older populations by the end of this century. So we need to connect the dots that healthy aging is something that has universal across, like even with the health span and lifespan disparities of the world, it's actually even more critical in those regions. All right, and there's one last data just to show this, that you might think because the United States invests so much in science and innovation, that they are increasing healthy life expectancy the most, which is not the case. So prior to the pandemic, the biggest life expectancy in the last 20 years was actually in the African region of the world, which gained 10 years per person for healthy life expectancy, mostly from reducing early and midlife mortality. But the United States, in that same period, only 4 months of an increase in healthy life expectancy. Now, the United States faces many problems, including obesity and lifestyle issues, as well as other things related to the healthcare system. But the big picture is that the richest countries are coming up against the biology of aging, and that places a limit. And what occurs when we continue trying to conquer each disease of aging is we are extending the period of time humans survive by managing multimorbidity and late life. So this, I think, is the most important slide that I have up here today, a brilliant piece by Geroscience in JAMA, From Lifespan to Healthspan. So the two color, the blue and the black line on the graph, depict how the aging of the American population has changed the pattern of death. So the dark line, you can see when children, this is for females, so the highest risk factors for mortality for females were under age 10. So this was smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis, polio, measles, all the infectious diseases that were at high rates of early life mortality. But by 2016, most of the deaths have been pushed beyond the 7th decade. And what's really useful about this graph is the red shaded area. As you get into later life, there's the onset of these diseases is magnified. So targeting just each single disease of aging will get diminishing returns. And you also have to ask, what will eliminating cancer mean in terms of what will replace it as the second leading cause of death? So the goal of Geroscience, I'm going to add a simulation, is to really push that period of the onset of age-related morbidity and frailty and disability as far as we can into the future, and have that replaced with more health during the 7th, 8th, and 9th decade of life. So a passage from Geroscience that shows it's not simply that there's more diseases as we get older, but they're often much more debilitating. So an unintended consequence of curing cancer would be an increase in the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. So the war against disease, which was a very effective frame to invoke during the sanitation revolution of abating infectious disease, has now become less of a useful frame for combating the health risks of late life. And Geroscience needs to become much more foundational to our approach to promoting health in late life. So again, just to cite Schuffel's piece on science communication as political communication, a frame always invokes some cognitive schema that helps us make sense. And the war against disease frame basically was the frame that said, the goal of public health and medicine is to save lives. And that made sense when we were abating the risks of dysentery, smallpox, and polio, because saving the life of a 10-year-old from smallpox conferred potentially many more decades of healthy life. But that same cognitive schema becomes a hindrance to thinking about public health innovation when populations are surviving past the 7th decade of life. Right, so this is Charles Winslow's War Against Disease. It argued that you target each disease one at a time. So for some diseases, you improve living conditions. For some, you vaccinate, and for others, you pasteurize the milk. He also described public health as protean. So as cholera and smallpox are abated, then new things come in. So malaria and polio, and then eventually it's cancer and heart disease. And the conception of victory for the war against disease is you save lives and ideally eradicate diseases. And this has real world political implications. When President Nixon declared a war against cancer in 1972, cancer was the second leading cause of death in the United States. It still is the second leading cause of death, but interventions and innovation has delayed the age of cancer death. But as Olshansky reminds us, that the end game of the war against cancer would be that this would actually unintentionally result in higher prevalence of more debilitating diseases. So we actually want to target biological aging itself. And so this really has significance for where most of biomedical research is invested. If you look at how much is spent on cancer and Alzheimer's disease, which are just two diseases where aging is the major risk factor, it dwarfs the amount of funding invested in the biology of aging, right? So we have a funding model that's predicated on intellectual presuppositions from the early 1900s rather than the 21st century. So for me, the way to look at this, we look to the past and we acknowledge how useful the tools of the war against disease were in abating early life mortality. But we have to remain plastic in our conception of what the tools and aspirations of public health and medicine are. Cognitive flexibility is critical to remaining on a course that improves population health for aging populations. This doesn't mean abandoning the aspirations of disease control, but supplementing that with what the gerontologist Alex Comfort called rate of aging control, which he envisioned would be something that the field that is now known as Geroscience could achieve. So this brings me to the very last part of my lecture, which is on geroscience and climate science. And so the motivation for writing this article, I noticed for many years, a lot of students in undergraduate and graduate level courses had a problem with advocating or proposing that science improve the health of people in late life by manipulating aging, because they perceive this to be something that exacerbates the risk of climate change. And so I actually decided to write an article that would help scientists see the interdependence between these two areas of science and abate the ageist narratives that are often stoked by climate change activism. We need to do action to combat the harmful effects of climate change, but we should not be doing that at a cost of circumventing other public health innovations that actually may lead to bigger public health benefits. So I'm going to leave you with this video, which is, it's not my voice, it's the professional narrator's voice, but it's my words that details what I argue in the Aging Cell commentary on the interdependence between the goals of healthy aging and climate science. All right, but I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I would encourage you to find out more about the fascinating science of geroscience and try to be part of the solution to ensure that we improve the health prospects of aging populations and rectify the ongoing healthspan disparities.
The future of humanity will be both warmer and older than it is today. Using prediction models, scientists at NASA have estimated that, depending on the steps taken for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the global temperature may rise by 2.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. Simultaneously, it is anticipated that 3.1 billion people will be over the age of 60 worldwide, including nearly 20% of the population in Africa, the world's youngest continent. Is it socially responsible in a warming planet of a population exceeding 8 billion people for science to aspire to develop gerotherapeutic drugs that aim to reduce the burden of aging-related diseases that may also increase lifespan? This question is, for the field of geroscience, the elephant in the room. It is a question the field must tackle head-on to avoid risking the marginalization of the science of healthy aging. While communicating what constitutes empirically valid and morally defensible ways of navigating the public health predicaments of climate change and healthy aging, science communication must be sensitive to both the interdependence of the environment and the mechanisms of aging, as well as the common misperceptions about the potential conflict between the goals of climate science and geroscience. Geroscience advocacy can transcend narratives of intergenerational conflict by highlighting the shared aspirations of climate science and geroscience, such as the goals of promoting health across the lifespan, redressing health disparities, and improving the economic prospects of current and future generations.